just to give 2 to 3 minutes more time for people to join in. I see the numbers increasing pretty rapidly, but let's wait.
Our lives.
Okay, so let me then start. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to our participants from around the world. We have friends from East Asia and various parts of the world, as well as from India. So thanks everyone for joining in. My name is Deepak Mishra. I'm the Director and Chief Executive of ICRIER, an Indian economic think tank based in New Delhi. We are hosting this event in partnership with Asia Development Bank Institute, ADBI, based in Tokyo. For those of us whose job is to keep a watch on global economic diplomacy, the last few months have been a feast, I think a festival of global economic diplomacy. We started in September with the Quad Heads of State meeting in Washington, DC, followed by the G20 in Rome, and then we had the COP26 meeting in Glasgow in November. And we are supposed to end the year with the 12th Trade Ministerial Conference in Geneva, which unfortunately got cancelled because of the rising threat of COVID-19 in Europe. But so when we're designing this workshop, we had all these milestones in mind. And along with this flurry of global economic diplomacy, some would say that there's also a great global power turbulence underway. And in the midst of all this, India, a rising economic power, is trying to find its own pace and space for global economic engagement. Some of the recent events have led people to believe that there might be a real shift in India's attitude to global economic engagement, both in style and in substance. But since we are not sure, we put a question mark to it, and our panelists would talk more about that. It seems India has also been successful, at least some believe so, that in trading its image of being part of the problem to being part of the solution of global engagement. So all this sounds very good to us and music to us in ICRIER because we have 3 thematic areas that this topic brings us together to. So we have the growth, employment, macroeconomy, the GEM team, the trade, investment, and economic integration team tier, and the climate change, urbanization, and sustainability team. So no wonder there's a lot of interest both within ICRIER and outside on this particular topic. So with this issue in the background, we are delighted to bring together a panel of experts. Some of them are the best in the field and have intimate knowledge of what the government is thinking, as well as good sense of global diplomacy landscape. And to top it off, we have a great moderator who understands and cares about these issues deeply. So let me pass the mic to Ms. Pooja Mehra, a journalist par excellence and author of the book, The Lost Decade, 2008 to 18, How India's Growth Story Devolved into a Growth Without a Story. Ms. Mehra writes for Mint, has worked at the Economic Times and India Today, Business Standard, and has been the economic editor at The Hindu. She received the Ramnath Goenka Award of Excellence in Journalism twice in 2008 and 9, and has received her master's in economics from Delhi School of Economics. So once again, welcome everyone to this webinar. Sit back, enjoy the conversation, and stay engaged by sending your questions, comments to the panelists and to the rest of the participants to the chat box. Thank you for your attention. Now let me pass on the mic to Pooja.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mishra. Thank you for inviting me to moderate this discussion, which promises to be very insightful, given the eminent speakers. Let me start by introducing the eminent speakers and then say a bit about the questions we would like to hear their views on today. Our first speaker today is Mr. V. Srinivas Ias. He's Special Secretary to Government of India in the Department of Administrative Reforms and Public Grievances, with additional charge for Director General, National Center for Good Governance. He has represented India on the International Monetary Fund from 2003 to 2006. He's currently writing his 3rd book, G20 at 2023, The Roadmap to Indian Presidency. After him, our second speaker today is going to be Mr. Chandra Bhushan. He's the president and CEO of the International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology. He's closely engaged with environment issues and is a subject expert. He's an expert member for the basic grouping of countries that include Brazil, South Africa, India, and China on climate change. I'll be very keen to hear his assessment of India's approach and the consequent changes it led to in the final text at Glasgow, especially with regard to the quibble over the coal power reduction versus elimination phrasing. Our third speaker today is Professor Sachin Chaturvedi. He's Director General at the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RIS, a New Delhi-based think tank. He's also a member on the Board of Governors of the Reserve Bank of India. Professor Chaturvedi has been very closely involved with Government of India's initiative for transforming India's economic policy making and economic diplomacy, and we expect to hear from him about the evolving approach to economic diplomacy and negotiating style. The broad question, that brings me to the broad question we are asking today, which is India's approach to global economic engagements changing? We are looking at India at, as Dr. Mishra said, the various summits, G20 summit in Rome, where PM Modi talked about the G20 leaders' commitment to climate change, and the Italian presidency reaffirmed the crucial role of multilateralism in finding solutions to world problems, of which WTO reforms and repair are as urgent as they get. I guess we'll have to see what happens at the WTO summit. There's also the COP26 at Glasgow, where also Prime Minister Modi said that the promises about climate finance support are somewhat hollow still, and have not moved beyond the Paris Agreement levels. And India's main interest is in tracking support by way of transfer of climate finance and low-cost climate technologies. And India expects developed countries to provide climate finance of $1 trillion at the earliest. And that progress on this should be tracked as closely as progress on mitigating climate change is tracked. So this is the broad sort of framework. And in that, the specific questions we are asking of our three panelists are that, what are the key takeaways from the G20 summit in Rome? Our second question today is COP26 the beginning of a new economic diplomacy for India? And for the third speaker, we'd like to hear on, will India's trade engagement mirror its aggressive stance at COP26 or G20? With that, I'd like to invite our first speaker, Mr. V. Srinivas, to address the first question, please.
A very good afternoon to Dr. Deepak Mishra, Madam Pooja Mehra, and all my distinguished colleagues, good friends, Sachin ji, and Mr. Chandra Bhushan, Mr. Morgan. It's good to come back to ICRIER again, an institution I've seen for many decades. And Srimati Ishwarja Jaulwalia was a good friend of mine. We were together in Washington, D.C. for several years. And she had a mission to see this institution strive and excel in bringing multilateralism to the fore and placing India at the center of multilateralist think tanks and dialogues. So I have very fond memories of her as I come back to ICRIER this year again to speak on a subject that's close to my heart. Last year I was at ICRIER speaking on G20, the Riyadh summit, and this time on the Rome summit. So thank you very much for inviting me today. My mind goes back to 2002. I was private secretary to the finance minister of India when India last held the presidency last chaired the G20 group of finance ministers and central bank governors. It was a very brief meeting. And then in my years in IMF, we heard the Americans and the other EU countries speaking of the G7 being expanded into a larger forum of grouping of countries with heads of government meeting on a regular basis to combat the global financial crisis. And that truly represented a high point of multilateralism. And if you see the journey in the last 15 years, what you do see is the G20 battling financial crisis, be it the global financial crisis of 2008-9, the Eurozone crisis of 2010, and of course the COVID-19 pandemic crisis of 2020. India has been a partner. It has shown deep commitment to multilateralism. We stand deeply committed to the 2030 agenda for sustainable development goals. We had supported the establishment of the Financial Stability Board, which looked at the too big to fail reforms. And for many years, we had been pressing very hard on the International Monetary Fund reforms and the shifting of 5% quota shares to emerging market economies that finally happened at the Hangzhou Summit. And the massive bailout package of 2020 of almost $10 trillion. And where the G20 has really succeeded was in putting in place enhanced surveillance of the financial system, and regulation has improved through the IMF's multilateral surveillance reports and also spillover reports. The G20's agenda has expanded vastly. Today it covers finance, trade, healthcare, education, anti-corruption, women's development, skill building, youth promotion. If I thought Buenos Aires had 60 meetings, and then by the time you come to Rome, 175 meetings in all in a space of 1 year. So there are so many ministerial meetings, there are working group meetings, there are think tanks who are meeting. So the agenda of multilateralism has become extremely vast. And one can say that the G20 has made a tangible and significant difference to people's lives. I was also very fascinated by the Hamburg principles of integrity and transparency, and the commitment that was made that we lift GDP by 2%, infrastructure investment by 1%. And however, the pandemic changed the dynamics of global governance. And if you see what is the big takeaway from the Rome summit, it's largely a continuation of the challenges that the global economy faced at the Riyadh summit, which were, there is a pandemic crisis and we need a COVID-19 accelerator. The ACT-A tools accelerator needed to be made operational, more diagnostics, more testing, more vaccines to the world. There was a debt crisis that was looming across sub-Saharan Africa. People could not afford even a single day of lockdown. People in Kenya were cooking lesser. And then the climate crisis. So in each of these had a multiplicity of options, policy options that needed to be taken. In fact, many G20 countries did not have too much fiscal space to put in place financial support structures. And you could see that Australia, Germany, Korea were the only countries which had large fiscal space. So they actually needed a lot of support from the monetary policy regimes to bolster the fiscal support that was needed, particularly in the pandemic space. Now, the question is, how has the Rome summit played out? The Rome summit focused on three areas: people, planet, and prosperity. So an international response to the pandemic, to build resilience to future shocks, a rapid recovery beyond the crisis, and third was sustained prosperity. So the world was witnessing a sharp economic recovery, about 5.9% in advanced economies, 6.3% in G20 economies. And the policy resources for financial support were witnessed in many G20 countries. The United States put in place, Germany put in place a fiscal support mechanism, Russia put in place, India had the Pradhan Mantri Anna Yojana, which was put in place. And but what was striking was there was a disparity in global distribution of vaccines. And to meet the WHO target of 40% of global population by end 2021 and 70% by mid-2022 remains a huge challenge. And the Italian presidency took the lead in convening a global health summit with vaccine pledges. To handle the debt crisis, the G20 came up with the policy option of extension of the debt service suspension initiative to end 2021. In fact, they did create certain new instruments for multilateral financing through the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, like the Catastrophe Containment Trust Fund, the Rapid Financing Instrument, along with the Poverty Growth Reduction Trust. And so additional financing measures were put in place, and a financing facility was promised for pandemic prevention. So we need to understand the contours of how this financing facility for pandemic prevention comes out in the coming years. The G20 also looked at reforms of global institutions. It continues to pursue the 16th general review of quotas at the IMF. It is supposed to be completed by end 2022. That would be a huge landmark so that emerging market economies get their due share. They're looking at reforms of the WTO, which has been a long-standing agenda, further strengthening of the Financial Action Task Force, and greater reforms in terms of regulatory surveillance to the both the BIS and the Financial Stability Board. India's positions at the G20 have been very supportive of the multilateral agenda, and we have asked for immediate and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan, which is a new feature, and we had lent full support to this call by the G20. We also proposed support to ensuring equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines for all. And we supported the tax deal, which will help address challenges which are posed by the digital economy, and also our support to resolve trade barriers. So the One Sun, One Grid initiative of the G20 was supported. We pitched ourselves as the trusted resource in pharmaceutical supplies across the world. And the WHO was asked to fast-track authorization of vaccines. So one can say in totality that the G20 was a tremendous success. A consensus was achieved on several areas: the global minimum tax, the setting up of a global body to respond to pandemics, future pandemics, a global vaccination target of about 40% population by end 2021. And it actually succeeded in rallying the forces of global ecological protection. So that is the way I would like to look at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Srinivas, for laying out for us that very descriptive takeaway from the G20 summit in Rome. I'd like now to request Mr. Chandra Bhushan to give us his sense of the COP26, and taking forward from what Mr. V. Srinivas said, can we say that COP26 marks the beginning of a new economic diplomacy for India in terms of India's interventions there? Mr. Chandra Bhushan.
Thank you, Pooja, and thank you, Deepak, for inviting me. I also have very fond memories of Ishar. We actually met for the first time in a lovely place of Lake Como. She and Montek were invited there to spend 1 month at the Rockefeller Center to write a book. And I was invited to attend a meeting there. And we spent a week together, learned a lot of things. So this is also a homage to, by participating in this, I never had the opportunity to attend any meeting of ICRIER before, but this is in a way my homage to Isha. And I'm really delighted that I'm here. My good friend Sachin, Mr. Srinivas, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here and discussing a very important topic. Let me start by saying that G20 has now become a precursor to decision at COPs. If you look at what is happening at G20 and COP, you generally find that this group of 20 countries do come together and more or less decide what is going to happen at COP. And then there is quibbling at COP. So you do quibble a little bit, but ultimately there is a convergence of decision between G20. And I'm talking more about climate. I follow climate change. I'm not going to talk about, finance transparency and other initiative that happened this time in Rome, and many other decisions that were taken. But as far as climate is concerned, just before COP, more or less it was clear that all the countries will agree to net zero. And that's what exactly happened. There was more or less consensus at G20 with South Africa and Russia coming on board on net zero, that India cannot remain behind, and India had to commit. So once Saudi Arabia and South Africa and Russia had decided, India too came in and announced its net zero target. So G20 is actually becoming a very important platform for climate change decisions. For many of us who engaged at UNFCCC, we now will have to watch G20 much more closely than what we did before, and also work and engage more at G20 level. So from my perspective, as a person working in environmental field, we will engage more at G20 because we think it is now becoming a much more powerful platform for decision making at UNFCCC. By the way, in any case, UNFCCC is a very messy process. We all understand the push and pulls of 197 odd countries at UNFCCC in terms of decision making. So therefore my opening comment is that many of the decisions that we saw at UNFCCC in many ways were driven at G20. That's my understanding. The second point I would like to make is there is a conflict in India's position on climate change, which for the first time has become quite apparent. If you would have seen how India positioned itself before COP26, and the discussion was largely about climate justice and climate space, and what Prime Minister Modi announced, there was a certain disconnect. Many of us did not expect that this net zero announcement will happen, or for that matter, a dollar figure will be uttered by Prime Minister of India. Okay. If that is the case, then there is certainly a subtle change in the way India is approaching climate finance. So far, India's position on climate finance has been within the framework of discussion at G77 plus China, or the other grouping, which is a grouping of 17 or 20 odd countries. I'm forgetting the name of the group. There are so many groups that you have to keep track of their name, from AOSIS to LMDC, like-minded developing countries. That's what the grouping is. So this $100 billion discussion, that was what India's framing was on climate finance. Certainly with $1 trillion remark of Prime Minister Modi that this is the kind of finance we will need, we have broken away from our traditional position on climate finance of that you have to give $100 billion by 2020. So I do see a certain movement, which is, and rightly so, I am very happy, breaking away from the traditional position that India has had on climate change negotiation, which is very principled, but not very effective. For 30 years, we have held on to equity and common but differentiated responsibility, but that principle has not driven the agenda of climate change in the benefit of India. And I am very happy that with net zero announcement, with $1 trillion amount on the table, an announcement by Prime Minister, we have moved the agenda forward from discussing how the burden will be divided to discussing how solutions will be implemented. So climate debate has always been about burden sharing, which I always thought was a very regressive approach to solve it. I think we have moved away from burden sharing discussion to solution oriented discussion, that we need money, we need resources, we are willing to do this, and this is how we will do it. This is what India's new position seems to be emerging. Now, in this perspective, where India is now talking about net zero investments, we have to understand what kind of money will be required. And there is still a disconnect between India's requirement of resources and India's ambition at the global level. Let me take a minute to exemplify this. When you sit at G20 table, you are not expected to get grants. I think this is the price we will have to pay for sitting on the high table. Whereas the requirement of India of climate is grants in many areas. Adaptation, for example. India will require grant. India might not require grant in mitigation, but in certain areas, grant will be required. Where commercially available money is not available, or for that matter, our public resources are not sufficient. So But that grant is not going to come simply because you are a G20 country now. You are expected to play the same game as other 19 countries. So there is a disconnect between how we are approaching climate finance and our ambition at the global level, which is also a reality check for us, simply because now we will have to think about climate finance more as investment than as grant. And our investment requirement is huge. If you look at IEA report of the net zero report of India, we need about $1.4 trillion from now till 2040 to not completely, partially decarbonize our economy. Our adaptation and resilience investment requirement is about $1 trillion. And I'm not talking about just transition investment that will be required to close coal mines and thermal power plants in eastern and central India. That could be trillions of dollars of investment that will be required. So I think on climate finance, while we have moved in the right direction of saying we will require investment, India needs a climate investment framework. We are in the beginning of a discussion on putting some figure on the table. I think we have to start talking about a framework under which we will receive this investment. We will have to reform our institutions to receive these investments. There will be billions and trillions of dollars available for investment in India. We will have to talk about terms and conditions of these investment. We will have to talk about where these investment will go. Of course, private sector will be a major recipient, but in areas like just transition, adaptation, resilience, private sector might not be the only recipient. There will be huge public agencies who will receive these investments. So a climate investment framework, within that framework, we now have to start our diplomacy on climate finance. A climate investment framework where we will also discuss the reform in global financial system. You do not want, if you're a vulnerable country, you do not want to pay more cost of capital. This is what also happens internationally. Your cost of capital increases if you are considered or perceived to be more risky. And most countries who are vulnerable to climate change will be perceived more risky. That is the nature of the thing. So also discussion on how we reform global financial system is going to be another important discussion that India will have to take leadership. Let me end by saying that the only investment framework that we have experience of is Montreal Protocol. And I'm talking more about international environmental governance. Under that framework, there is a multilateral fund that gives you incremental cost. This is what we understand in terms of international funding for environment. This experience is not sufficient because no one is going to pay us incremental cost for setting up renewable energy because there is none. Renewable and batteries are becoming commercially viable. What you need is investments, and maybe at a concessional rate. Or, for example, changing the technology in the steel sector and fertilizer sector and cement sector, where your private sector might require massive amount of investment at a concessional rate. So the climate and environmental finance of the past is not going to be the investment and finance requirement of the future. And I think a lot of work is required for India to develop this, what I have called as a climate investment framework and move ahead. Let me end here, and I'll be most happy to take any question that is there. Thank you very much.
Pooja, you're still muted.
Thank you, Mr. Chandra Bhushan. Thank you for crystallizing the issues on how negotiations have to go beyond just the summit level. And, perhaps a lot of work needs to now be done in between these multilateral summits. And you also crystallized the areas where this needs to be done in terms of not only organizing climate finance grants versus commercially available money, but also the frameworks in which this money will be channeled through, whether the requirement on institutions development, the requirement on the terms and conditions that will lead this money towards economies that are very vulnerable to climate change. And as you say, vulnerability also determines the risk associated with an economy. So on these broad points, if Professor Sachin Chaturvedi could make his comments on what could India be expected to do to keep pace with these requirements, and also, what sort of aggressive stance can be expected now in trade engagements from India?
Thank you.
Also,
Thanks.
to say that we are running quite behind time. So, we're running almost 15 minutes behind time. So if you like, you can speak for longer than 15-20 minutes.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, we're running ahead of time.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot, Ms. Mehra. Let me at the outset thank ICRIER for giving this opportunity. Thanks, Deepak. I'm so glad Mr. Srinivas and my dear friend Chandra have already set the tone very well. I think in very substantive, analytically rich intervention, Mr. Srinivas has drawn the larger landscape within which we have been engaging in G20 and other international platforms. And Chandra, as usual, has done a brilliant job in terms of identifying the broad contours and the CBDR related limitations that are there. Having heard them, I feel 4 points are important, which I would like to highlight. And first of them definitely comes to my mind in terms of the kind of institutional linkages that India should develop. Now, we have seen several tracks where different ministries have been nodal points. Even divisions within ministries have not been on the same page. But we are now realizing that with this leadership right now, both Ministry of External Affairs, Ministry of Commerce and Industry, and also, or to a great extent, I would say, Ministry of Finance, their international positions are now converging on several platforms. And this is a very positive development, which we need to accelerate further. The idea of one government PM gave, I think, right in his first year itself. And that one government idea is now taking some shape when it comes to international positioning of India. And that, I think, is a very positive and very encouraging development. Probably it requires to be further strengthened because you do not have institutional ecosystem to synthesize various positions which are emerging. And that's the role probably in the meanwhile, and in that vacuum, several think tanks have to play. They need to synthesize with several subject experts who come from environment background, multilateral backgrounds that are related to finance, and backgrounds that are related to trade, technology, and also international investment. So how do you get several experts, think tanks with different orientations on one page? The idea of polarization among ideological divides that have been there probably is blurring away, as Chandra very rightly articulated, because we are going towards solution-oriented development agenda. And that, I think, strengthens my point in terms of how these interlinkages have to be seen. And for that, the necessary institutional ecosystem that we need as we move forward as part of Troika in G20, and eventually we take over as the presidency. I'm also very emphatic in terms of not just the presidency and our delivery as a president of the G20, but also post-presidency. What footprint we want to leave and what is it that we want to carry forward after the presidency. So we have to be very clear in terms of what development paradigm we bring on table. So it's, and that's the second point. How we are creating the institutional ecosystem is the first. The second is, what do we do after we relinquish the presidency? So for that, the preparedness has to be in terms of the kind of issues that we need to focus on. probably in terms of norm setting, what kind of role we want to play as part of the norm setting exercise at the global level. Be that as part of the group which is away from the CBDR and as part of the new norms, as part of the solution oriented approach, perfectly fine, I have no issue. But what kind of new dimension we want to bring in, new kind of global governance that we look at in this new global order that we have been talking about. So from that perspective, I have been thinking in terms of the broad development paradigm which is on the table. And this is when you have a huge geopolitical contestation which is on between China and the US. And this is just coming out from RBI meeting where we discussed several issues related to cryptocurrency. How do you manage? How do you bring in convergence? How do you evolve institutional systems to bring in convergences that are necessary to manage this geo-strategic divide, which is encouraging both the digital currencies, but also private cryptocurrencies. So from that point of view, I think though we are still stuck on trade platform, whether we need trans-border data transportation, do we need intertemporability between the data? Do we need data localization? Do we need trans-border norms for data? Do we need data for development, data localization? And number of permutation combinations which determine our position on e-commerce, that determine our position on data localization, and also in terms of how foreign banks in India behave. So all that is something that cannot be left on one ministerial track or other. We have to have a coherent, cogent view when it comes to some of these issues. So institutions moving together, ministries moving together is one dimension on which we have fortunately started moving. But our collective understanding of the turf battles between the ministries, the roles and the remits that are there for various agencies and institutions would also have to be converged. And that requires our collective understanding of issues. And that's where more narrative building, more collective thinking is needed. And fortunately now, the government and the Prime Minister himself has been encouraging ideas from outside the government, not just depending on bureaucrats, and bureaucrats now know it very well that they need to consult people from outside. And that position has changed. More research-based, evidence-based analysis is becoming part of the decision-making system. And we are getting ideas which are for 5 years or 6 years back, you won't have imagined. New channels have been created which are bringing in new issues. So this is part of domestic exercise that we need to do. And Ms. Mehra, the question that you asked about, what is it that we need in terms of aggressive stance? I think one aggression that has to come in is in terms of our own domestic preparedness for such positioning that we are looking at. The second positioning that is needed is what the External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, is leading with Quad. And I think the Quad related reverberations which are there, articulations which are there on our economic diplomacy, on our science, technology, innovation approach, the Quad statement on technology policy are articulations which are absolutely clear in terms of what positioning we need. But there are certain issues on which Quad hasn't taken a position, but we still have to see in what direction it's going. Like, for instance, the debt crisis, which is happening in several countries. My dear friend Chandra mentioned that we cannot be aid recipient. No, we are not, Chandra. We are now providing a huge money as part of our outgoing development assistance. And this is happening for the last several years. I did a book in 2016, which came out from Cambridge University Press, and I called it Logic of Sharing. So India shares. India has been sharing. Now, for last 4 years, we were giving something like $5.87 billion every year. And we are receiving only $5.67 billion from our donors. So the gap is expanding. Now, if you put all the LOC portfolio together and the buyer's credit, your portfolio is far richer and far higher. You are providing assistance to many countries. And you are doing it through multimodal engagements with these partner countries, be that part of the CLMV, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, or our friends in Africa. We are part of that process. We are part of that engagement, where we are not just with begging bowl everywhere. But important thing is here, and there I would like to make 3 points. One is in terms of our idea of access, equity, and inclusion, where we have been pressing both in terms of equity in distribution, like for instance of vaccines, but also the assistance. If IMF reforms are delivering after a lot of persuasion from G20, only $675 billion, and out of that $375 billion is going only to OECD countries, and only $21 billion is coming as part of fiscal stress that LICs are going through, then you really need to revisit the idea of access and equity and inclusion that is needed. And the global reforms that you are talking about would have to be in synchronous with the points that you have been raising in terms of the Basel reforms that are needed, and the reforms that G20 has been pressing for of multilateral institutions. So, Ms. Mehra, my first point here is very much about the idea of access, equity, and inclusion, which Prime Minister Modi raised not only at G20, but also at COP26. The idea of justice is very much part of the new narrative that India is bringing, which is dovetailing our strategic positioning of economic diplomacy tools, which are evident across not only through Ministry of External Affairs, but also through Department of Economic Affairs, and also the Commerce and Industry. So you find a coherent approach emerging gradually when the broad contours are there. The second position is about some of the contentious issues. In certain WTO ministerials, India never showed any willingness to join any working group. I was seeing in the chat box some concern about RCEP. But I think I would very much like to bring out here that after we came out of RCEP, the feeling is in terms of getting into FTAs. The new Commerce Secretary is far more pragmatic and far more open in terms of discussing India's new approach on free trade agreements. We have signed an agreement with Mauritius. No one talks about it. Mauritius may be a small country. We are also engaging with the African continental-wide free trade agreement. We are engaging with many other countries. EU and US are some, but then many more are being opened up. So we need to see what this new narrative on trade is coming. The idea is not FTA or non-FTA. The idea is how much opening we are doing of the trade, industry, and economy. And that's where openness is coming in. We are now open. If you recall, Ms. Mehra, we walked out of the group which was on e-commerce at WTO. Now we are engaging ourselves on data localization. We are engaging ourselves on digital trade, of which we rejected completely. So there are these new instruments and new awareness, new areas of partnerships which are there. If you see the statement that came out from Ministry of External Affairs after the first Sherpa meeting, which Piyush Goyal attended as part of our engagement with the Indonesian presidency, 5 issues are very clear. We have engaged ourselves with plethora of groups, be that anti-corruption, health, development, education, employment, digital economy, all groups India engaged. So we are now giving this message that there is a coherent approach, there is institution-wide approach, and there is also willingness to engage with new issues. The second is, while we engage with you, we have our agenda as well. CIM was very clear in terms of local food culture, traditional knowledge, and also our idea of protecting MSME interests, and also the circular economy, something that hitherto we were not part of the dialogue on SDG Goal 12. So this kind of issues are evident to what Prime Minister raised in COP26 about consumption patterns. And this was very much part of those of you who have observed India's BRICS presidency. Since I was involved in it, we did this report, RIS and ORF together, on consumption pattern on SDG 12. And we showed how India's consistent commitment on Paris agreement is different from other BRICS countries. So this strength of India, we need to realize, This changing India we need to appreciate, and we also need to see how several of these policy dialogues are there. Before I close, Ms. Mehra, I also want to mention that in the G20 and other platforms, there are several engagement groups which are ranging from civil society to women to think tanks to many others. And I think we need dialogues at their platform as well. It's not just G2G. These platforms, of course, are led by G, but they also have huge space for think tanks, for research institutions, for civil society, for women's groups, for labor groups. How are they perceiving these changes and the challenges? Are they part of the same narrative, or they are on different pages? So this is also important as a nation for us to think in terms of economic diplomacy is not just through the government. It's through business, it's through several other stakeholders. And that convergence, that coherence is also important, as long as all are also engaging in this new narrative which is unfolding. So from that perspective, I feel it is equally interesting for us to see how these intellectual inputs, which I said in the beginning in terms of system being open for new ideas, I think are also going to crystallize our approach on several of these contentious issues, which hitherto we always kept outside our view. And that I think also brings in, like what Finance Minister said at COP26, that they have under-delivered in finance, which Chandra pointed out. That was also the point which Prime Minister raised during his intervention at Glasgow. And so many of our civil society members and other entities also raised. So I think from that perspective, it is absolutely clear. This was also clear when CIM spoke in the G20 meeting, not in context of climate finance, but in context of the trade facilitation support, the aid for trade. So North is not delivering is also very clear. And that dimension we need to bring out. So the coherence among them was my fourth point, and I would stop with that. I'm open to questions from your side. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chaturvedi. Just to now introduce the element of debate, if I could request you to address the very sharp point that Mr. Chandra Bhushan made about India's negotiating strategy being quite principled, but not that effective. So are you agreeing with him when he says that it's not effective?
Pooja, I think what we need to understand is what principle we are referring to. When Prime Minister raised the question of the climate justice, I do not think if any country left us behind. We were very much part of the process. So which principles we are talking of, which principle Chandra had in his mind when he made that observation? I think the changing times require us to evolve our understanding and approach and do not remain stuck in the past. And this is what is now a reality with which Prime Minister has been addressing. Our idea of walking out of RCEP, again, I would pick up, cannot be taken as our position on FTA. Because within 1 month, we signed our agreement with Mauritius. So we are not principally against on FTAs. So the point here is that these principles which we are referring to are part of the realpolitik. And these principles are principles which are governing our national economic interests. And hitherto, we have been taking global principles as our guiding elements at the global negotiations, irrespective of what damage or gain we are having for our national economic interests.
I'll come to the point.
Very often, let me just finish. Very often, these principles were also defined by the bureaucracy alone. That's no more the case. In last 5-6 years, you would see how stakeholder consultations have grown. Interests of business, interests of civil society, interests of many larger actors are being factored in our global positioning. So the narrative around principles has also widened.
Right. I'll come to the point on FTAs you made, but would Mr. Chandra like to respond to that point on what principles versus effectiveness he'd like Professor Chaturvedi perhaps to say more on? And then we'll take questions from the audience. We have a few questions from the audience.
The point I was making was that, see, for a long time, India has been saying that, and that was what was enshrined in UNFCCC, common but differentiated responsibility and respective capability, equity, for example. Now, in that debate, there is a finite carbon space, we know, but to assume that we can divide that carbon space and then allocate to every country, and then every citizen within country, think about the ramification of that within our own country. In that case, Bihar can say, how can Gujarat have more per capita carbon emission than us? It is our right. So I don't think we think through the ramification of principle that we espouse within our own boundary. So it is very important to understand, while CBDR as a principle is fine of global climate justice, it is unimplementable. And this is what developed countries did for 30 years. They fought with us on the principle, kept emitting. Today, we are left with 15% of carbon space for 1.5C. Even if today you tell United States to become net zero by 2035, they will still misappropriate more carbon space than what we will. Their emissions is about 5 billion tons. And what about China? What has China done in last 20 years? China has remained part of this LMDC and developing countries. And today its emissions are close to one third of global. And it is not going to come down. It is planning to peak by 2030. There is no way we can meet 1.5C target with China's emissions peaking in 2030. So I think principles are fine, but principles are not the end. They are means to achieve an end. Somehow in our case, principle become an end, which is problematic. So this point has to be understood. And I am very happy. I can tell you right now that I do see our position at UNFCCC evolving on this matter. We are recognizing what is going to be the reality. For example, technology transfer. Now we keep talking about technology transfer without defining what we mean by technology transfer. Everyone talks about technology transfer, and I have asked, is there a white paper on technology transfer that we can put forward? What is it that we need? So we will have to do very hard work at home if we really want to meaningfully engage internationally, because they will come out with new and newer agenda. At COP26, there was a methane agenda, there was a forestry agenda, there was a coal agenda. You talked about phase down and phase out. We were not prepared to answer it cogently. That is the point also I'm trying to make.
Professor Chaturvedi, do you want to respond, or should we take?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, Chandra, the kind of effort that is needed from other actors, like I give you one example. I was part of the team that negotiated the SDGs, and we led to the establishment of the Technology Facilitation Mechanism, TFM. This was 2011, and 12 we worked, 13 we worked on that. Finally, India and Brazil and France worked together to get the TFM on ground in SDGs. When we asked for money, they said we would discuss it separately, and the whole Addis Ababa action agenda came up for illicit financial flows and many other things. The idea of technology was taken out and TFM was floated. You tell me how many countries have given details on technology that are available for countries enabling sustainable development agenda among themselves. Germany came forward to create a technology bank in Istanbul, country which is not known for technology. So there have been consistent efforts by the developed country to divide the South, and South has been unmindful of these games collectively. India alone cannot do this, but TFM was something that we could achieve. Eventually, France and India could launch ISA, and we have something on track in terms of the institutional ecosystem. So I absolutely fully agree with you that on CBDR, we have done good to bring in rationality, purpose, and objective to it. But I think we require far more synthesis in terms of what technology transfer. I mean, the papers like even from RIS itself, some of my other colleagues, Dr. Nagesh and Biswajit, both have produced papers on technology transfer, even in the field of environment technologies. So we need to see that technology transfer per se, your ability to absorb those technologies, the ability of the firms which are getting into it, to what extent it has happened. Has it happened with the FDI? Have we gained? Chandra, you are aware of all that literature. So the issue really is that whatever we say, whatever we demand, may not actually happen. But there is no point in losing out on that front, because eventually you need what is required to be done. I give you just one example. When India supported Mozambique to produce solar panels, the immediate concern of Mozambique was that tomorrow China would start dumping panels and this unit would collapse. And this is, I'm talking about 2013. 2015, India asked our own institutions to help Mozambique become WTO member and insulate their import regime from dumping by China of solar panels. So smaller countries require far greater support. Our ability to help Fiji to get technologies, or even our Ministry of Earth Sciences, thanks to Dr. Shailesh Naik, that we did a monsoon program for 21 Indian Ocean countries to cope up with monsoon-related predictions after tsunami. You know, for last 6 years, immediately after the tsunami in 2005, so 6 to 12, our Ministry of Earth Sciences has helped these 21 countries in Indian Ocean to cope up with this. So it's not that technology transfer is not happening. India has done it, and I'm giving you an example of that, but not many countries have done that. So we need to see how some of that can happen, how that can be strengthened further. And there is no point in we giving out on this demand. The possibility is there, the modality is there, the instrument is there. There are successful stories, and they can be done. Development alternative, as you know, Chandra, Dr. Khosla and his team, they are doing it for technologies that are related to several African countries, which civil society is doing. So triangular cooperation in that is fairly possible. Several OECD countries are doing it, and I think we should work that out. And I don't rule out that possibility. But we giving up that negotiating space is something that, in my view, we should not do. We should keep that broad echo on, but see our strategic and economic interests.
Thank you, Professor Chaturvedi. I'd like to now invite Mr. Srinivas to give us his perspective on this discussion on principled versus effective negotiation style and strategy. And also there's a question for him that has come for the audience. So after he's addressed this point, if he could please take up this question, which is, emerging markets are now at the forefront of the G20 discussions. During the Indian presidency in 2023, which is something he's writing a book on, we'll have the first emerging markets troika. So does he think this itself is a point of inflection in the G20 process and economic diplomacy, or is it only coincidental? Also, what are the areas where the trio of Indonesia, India, and Brazil can lead successfully?
I think it's a fascinating question that has come in. Let me try to broaden the debate rather than limit it to climate issues alone, because the G20 handles a gamut of issues, and the global community is coming out of a year of massive losses, deep scars, and sharp increases in poverty. The pandemic has left very, very deep scars. And the search for vaccines is still on. The search for ensuring universal vaccination is still on. And India's principles with regard to equity in vaccines is something that is highly commendable, and that has merited global attention. Similarly, we have been continuing to promote multilateralist efforts with regard to creating digital inclusion, financial inclusion, digital governance models, as also on anti-corruption with regard to IMF reforms. Each of these are based on modern realities and principles-based governance reform of international institutions. So India's positions are very much consistent with the ideals of multilateralism that the nation has propagated on the global fora over a period of several decades. In fact, as the world prepares for a post-pandemic recovery, there still remains a massive challenge of the debt crisis. There still remains a massive challenge of the vaccine crisis. And of course, climate action, as has been discussed, continues to pose challenges. So these will remain the continuing agenda as we go forward. Yes, it is interesting to note that 3 emerging market economies will hold the troika in the coming years. And what should be the agenda taking it forward? Of course, the G20 witnesses a number of smaller grouping meetings also. The BRICS meets on the sidelines of the G20. There's also been the meetings of the Russia, India, China on the G20 sidelines, along with the Japan, United States, India meetings. So each of these fora all fit into the larger agenda. And the one big area that the emerging market economists would be looking at is reforms in the International Monetary Fund and other global institutions. How should the quota and voice of emerging market economies be further enhanced in these international institutions would be a continuing agenda, and a successful conclusion of the 16th review of quotas would be something that they would be looking at. The second big area they would be looking at is how do we take forward the debt sustainability, debt service sustainability initiative, because private creditors have not fully joined. The debt crisis still remains fairly high in sub-Saharan African countries. How would EMEs like to look at continuing fiscal incentives? When should the stimulus be withdrawn? And what would be the pledges that the advanced economies would be making for further extension of the DSSI is something that would be a big area for the emerging market economies. Prime Minister Modi has been speaking and in his several meetings in the Rome summit, as also from his participation in G20 from Brisbane in 2014 till date, about 8 summit meetings. There have been certain areas of commonality which he has been pushing forward. And these include a stronger action for combating money laundering, stronger action to crack down on technology-driven terrorism, greater surveillance, particularly through financial stability assessments. Similarly, an anti-corruption agenda which remains very strong, which is focused on meritocracy and also on strong audit mechanisms, and presenting India's developmental journey on a global forum, that is financial inclusion, digital connectivity, and immunization. So I think there would be an element of continuity in terms of the global agenda of reforms of international institutions which would continue to be pursued. There would also be a greater presentation of how India's governance models, particularly its democratic models, strong institutional structures, have succeeded in ensuring stability and growth over the past 75 years. And it would provide us an opportunity to present the Indian governance model in the Committee of Nations as we go forward.
Mr. Srinivas, if I may ask a follow-up question, which is when we talk about effectiveness, and you spoke of vaccination, issues, equity, we know that rich countries have vaccinated more than 70% of their eligible population, and we know there are countries in this world who have not even managed to cover 3% of the eligible population. So when we talk of effectiveness, would you like to address this inequity and a lack of effectiveness, if I may say?
Yes, this is a major challenge, and this was what the Italian presidency also pointed out, that there is an urgency with which we need to ensure vaccine equity is propagated. And as I was looking at the Italian presidency's comments in the inaugural session, he has asked countries to make generous vaccine pledges for poorer countries. And he has said that to address vaccine inequality, the world must continue to invest in research, eliminate trade barriers affecting COVID-19 vaccines, and enhance predictability in delivery. And there's also a need to strengthen global supply chains, expanding manufacturing capacity at local and regional levels. And further, it needs to be borne out that financing is a very important feature. And India's commitment to produce over 5 billion COVID vaccine doses by end 2021 to help the world against the pandemic is a significant commitment. We've also called upon the WHO to fast track processes for emergency use authorization of the COVID-19 vaccines. So India stands up to fulfill its commitments. It also needs to be seen how much the new instruments of financing that have been created, particularly the CCRT, which is the catastrophic containment trust that has been created, as also the rapid financing instrument. These are availed by the LDC countries to ensure adequate access to financing, to ensure timely procurement of vaccines are available. These are some things that only the future can foretell. And a post-pandemic recovery would only be possible when vaccine equity is ensured. And I'm sure the G20 countries would be working very closely with each other to ensure realization of their objectives that have been laid out in the communique. In fact, the G20 finance ministers and health ministers met several times in 2020 and a very large number of times even in 2021. Going forward, I expect there would be greater coordination between the finance and health ministries across the globe to ensure vaccine equity is something that is realized. It cannot be done by a single country. Multilateralism alone can make it possible. And as Prime Minister Draghi has said, the form of cooperation we know best is multilateralism. I think that.
Yeah, I think and there it's quite unfortunate that the pledge that was taken could not we didn't see the follow through in the WTO on the IP waiver for vaccination. We have questions from the audience. There's a question for Professor Chaturvedi, which I think he has already taken note of because I see a response from him. Professor Chaturvedi, the question for you, what challenges would India face if it carries out institutional reforms? And what are your thoughts on trade and inclusivity? And I'll add to that my question, since you said if FTAs that, and especially the one with EU, from what I understand, after 2013, there hasn't been much progress on the negotiations with the EU on the FTA.
Yeah, no, that's right. What is happening now, Ms. Mehra, is in terms of our changing engagement. If I refer to your point, the last point on EU, the India-EU connectivity agreement, which happened in May, that statement is a very comprehensive statement in terms of multi-level engagement of India and EU. Of course, it is not about trade, but it is about connectivity of various sorts. And there are almost 27 areas for connectivity which have appeared in this very, very substantive statement from our side, Prime Minister himself led it, and there are several post-statement meetings which are emerging between India and EU. So trade agreement may take time, but important is institution. And I think the question that you referred to in the beginning is very important. What kind of institutional reforms we need? In WTO, as you know, we are facing a huge challenge in terms of the Bali agreement, where agriculture is a big issue. How do we reconcile with our global commitment and our domestic issues which are there? So institutional reforms would pose a major challenge, and we need to see how our international narratives, international commitments, and domestic institutional preparedness, they sync. And they sync to an extent that we create an India which is open for entrepreneurship, and we are out of the mindset with which we grew for many decades in terms of entitlement. So how we make a shift from entitlement-based growth development approach to entrepreneurship-based development approach. And this requires new incentive structures. It requires new institutional bandwidth to provide support, but it also requires new financial instruments to be devised and evolved so that you bring in all stakeholders together. You need to convince people that it is not against them, but it is about a new development strategy that we want, where you incentivize all those who are working with startups, who are in any kind of informal sector, but all those who are going to be part of this entrepreneurship-led development strategy with localization of development agenda that we are talking of. So trade reforms or compatibility with the global trade commitments, they require huge institutional reforms. And these institutional reforms would come in, as I said in the beginning, not just when government alone is doing it, but only when you have many other actors coming together with you for delivering what is required to be delivered. And that's when the successful economic diplomacy can happen. Economic diplomacy is not about what diplomats do. It is very much about what economic actors within the country are doing when it has to be extrapolated to our international relations.
Thank you. There is a question about the effectiveness or the how much implementable is the COP20 pledge that India has taken. If that is a question from Kanupriya, are the pledges taken by India at COP26 realistically achievable within the stated time frame? I guess that is a question for Mr. Chandra Bhushan.
Very much achievable, in fact, but I would like all of us to understand that our climate pledge has huge implications on what is happening domestically. And I do see this pledge as also having a huge co-benefit. You know, we have less water, 30% land getting degraded, we have massive air pollution, and then we will have the ramifications of extreme weather event and climate change. So I think we have to look at this entire climate debate from the perspective of not only cost, which a lot of modeling study that many of you would have seen, they only talk about cost. We also have to think about benefit, co-benefit opportunities. There's massive opportunity for this country to move to the next generation of industrial transformation, which climate change will do, whether it is in heavy industries or in energy sector. So I think it is very much achievable. I think it will add to India's growth and development. It will also have benefit for India's local environmental problem. So very much achievable. I just want to add another point. Maybe there is some miscommunication here. Sachin, I have nothing against principled global relationship. In fact, international relationship has to be based on certain principle, but the principle cannot paralyze. Okay, I think that is the point that I was trying to make. The principle will have to be flexible and realistic in terms of also national self-interest. Every country has self-interest. Every country looks after itself in the broader framework of international cooperation. So I will be the last one to say that India should not have a principled approach to vaccine equity. Okay, that is something that has to be there. But how do we achieve it? By saying is something that we need to keep evolving and working on. So, so very much happy with what India has announced, and going ahead, our ambitions should also increase, as we should push other countries also to increase their ambition on climate action.
We have a question from Binay K. Jha. Do you see de-development finding any place in the COP conversations, or will the dialogues be depending primarily on development and investments alone? Mr. Bhushan, if you'd like to take it.
You know, I'm really bad at nomenclatures, frankly. Let me say that redevelopment, de-development, you know, the discussion at COP is going to be in terms, and every country is going to take its position at climate negotiation, understanding what it is going to do in terms of saving itself, because we are now entering a phase of climate crisis where the impacts are going to exacerbate. So countries are not only going to talk about mitigation, which has huge amplifications on developmental agenda, but countries are also going to talk a lot about adaptation and resilience, loss and damage, and just transition. Okay, so the entire development agenda will now be a combination of things that we will be doing going ahead, and countries will decide their priorities on how they are going to move ahead.
Pooja, there's a question also for Chandra regarding this. If you can't see, let me read it out. It says, could you please define climate investment and how it is different from the existing financial mechanisms like grants and concessions?
Well, we fortunately, I think Ministry of Commerce is actually working on a taxonomy for sustainable finance, which should be out very soon, which will define what is green finance. Climate investment will include concession and grant. Concession and grant are method of providing finance. And we have to define climate finance in terms of what all investment will be called as climate finance or green finance. So, you know, you will have concessional loan, concessional investment and grants as part of climate finance.
I think, does that bring us to the end of the questions that we have, or do we have any more questions? We probably have time just for one more question, and either Mr. Mishra or any of the panelists can take it up. This is a question from me, and we spoke a lot today, discussed institutional reforms at the India level, but there's also this institutional reform at the WTO level that is very much the requirement. And if you know, what is sort of what is India's role going to be in this, which is the dispute resolution mechanism, which was frozen by the Trump presidency, and we are not seeing much progress on that. Would anybody like to take that question up? Mr. Mishra, maybe you would like to take that up?
I think it's Sachin's territory. I'll pass it on to him.
Thank you. Thanks, Deepak. I think the issue is absolutely clear, and I think I did refer to it in terms of our engagement with these institutions, and that I think is absolutely important. It goes back to what Chandra was saying, that the lexicon which is emerging, the new changes that are needed, we need to absorb them. We need to see what new response should be, and once we are in sync, then solution-oriented approach would become quite handy. But otherwise, we would be keeping, you know, opposition and sort of stepping out of the process all the time. So we need to understand that, engage in, and provide new orientation to institutional reforms. It's happening in India already. Bibek Debroy-led committee has suggested several changes in several legislations which have happened. And I think this would continue. It would smoothen our engagement with the international institutions where domestic legislative frameworks are in contradiction or conflict. It would also enable our specific actors to participate. But at the same time, we also need to see where reforms are actually needed and where we are not just a norm-taking country. We are also proactively setting the norms. But that platform we would have to choose. The timing we would have to see how it comes up within our own broad development priorities. So I don't think if there can be any sweeping yes or no to it, but definitely it has to be contextualized and to be stated, analyzed in specific context of a sector. So sector specific.
Sorry.
Pooja, I just wanted to say that, while our position on trade and climate is very clear, we do not want climate change to be used as, as a method for trade restrictions and those kind of things. But I think we have to be prepared because this discussion is not going away. They will bring this, developed countries are going to bring this discussion at different platforms and in different forms. I also think India has a lot of advantage because of our high energy cost. Our industries are possibly one of the most efficient in the world on energy. So there's nothing for India to be worried about. The general assumption that our industries are inefficient is not true. The economic of India's energy demands that we be efficient. Our energy cost is one of the highest in the world. So, but I think we have to be very well prepared going ahead to discuss this issue in a way that we can defend our self-interest. Okay. And by just saying that we will not engage is not going to be a good strategy going ahead on trade and climate.
And there's a question, I think, again for Professor Sachin Chaturvedi from Shanki Navani. In the current
I think Mr. Srinivas wanted to say something. He had raised his hand.
Yes,
Sorry.
I wanted to come in to say that India has been a founder member of many of the global institutions. We've been a founder member of the Bretton Woods institutions even before independence, and Chintaman Deshmukh went to attend the Bretton Woods conference, and multilateralism has grown with Indian democracy, and there is a convergence of views that India has had across multilateral organizations. That's what I see, having served, represented India in 3 international institutions at the IMF, at the International Cotton Advisory Committee, and now on the International Institute of Administrative Sciences. I do see tremendous convergence. And as my mentor, Dr. Y.V. Reddy would say, there is a lot of convergence. And also we have been poster childs for multilateralism at many institutions. So in terms of institutional reform, there is tremendous convergence that we've had with most of the international institutions. And of course, there is always further reform that is possible, as I said, in terms of quota envoys, in terms of greater trade equity, dispute resolution mechanisms, and in terms of climate finance. These are emerging areas, but what should not be forgotten is that India has had multilateralism and contributed to multilateralism on a global scale for several decades. And even pre-independence, we've been supportive of international institutions.
I think, yeah, now's a good time for India to play that role again, especially with the WTO, because it's kind of in desperate need for reform and revitalizing. The question that I was reading out for Professor Sachin Chaturvedi is from Shanki Navani. In the current scenario, securing a TRIPS waiver on COVID-19 vaccines and medical supplies is important for ensuring a sustainable economic recovery. Will the TRIPS Council meeting help in ending vaccine nationalism? How do India and the multilateral forums intend to increase coordination between finance, health, innovations, and fair and equal dissemination of health innovations and technology across the world? What will the role of the private sector in bringing about such reforms be?
Thank you. Thanks, Ms. Mehra. I think this issue goes beyond national aspirations that are related to vaccine. The major impediment that we have got on this has come not from US this time, but from EU. US has explicitly supported, and the USTR in her statements have made it absolutely clear their consistent support and also overcoming domestic reservations about it. Just as they were preparing for MC12, her statements were very clear. But unfortunately, EU industrial houses were opposed to the idea of a blanket TRIPS exemption for all the vaccines for all the countries. And that's where the conflict has precipitated. The chair for TRIPS at WTO has made several efforts, but unfortunately, even before the MC12 was postponed, the TRIPS committee could not arrive on one conclusion for TRIPS exemption. The caveats that came in from EU were huge. And in fact, with a lot of our research partners in Europe, we'd found out that Germany was the country that was trying to come up with exemptions. Just before the G7 ministerial, President of France made it clear that they are in support of the TRIPS exemption. So it was largely Germany that blocked and encouraged EU to take a position which was restrictive of this blanket exemption. As of now, this has not been resolved in the TRIPS committee, and fortunately or unfortunately, the WTO ministerial MC12 has been postponed. I hope when they meet, since all decisions in WTO are to be taken up only when there is 100% agreement. So TRIPS exemption arriving at some conclusive point seems to be very difficult. But unfortunately, that's the reality. We cannot go anywhere.
There's one more question related to the private sector and a possibility of private sector working with the government. This relates to climate finance. This is a question from Pradeep Panthi of the ADBI. How is the willingness of the private sector to join hands with government with climate financing in India? Do financial institutions, private and public, both, are they taking initiative on some options such as climate bonds? Would you like to take it, or would Mr. Chandra Bhushan like to take it, or would Mr. Srinivas like to take it?
I think we have more qualified here, Chandra or Mr. Srinivas, whoever. Chandra.
Let me. Something dramatic happened at Glasgow. Banks and investment firms worth about $130 trillion, if I'm not wrong, came together, including some of India's private banks, to discuss climate finance at Glasgow. If I'm not wrong, we had representation from SBI also in that meeting, and many private banks from India were part of that discussion within the financial sector on how the global financial sector will enable this transition to net zero and on all the things that we are talking about. So I think Indian private sector is gearing up to the next phase of the kind of global capital that will come in. They need to be much more engaged in this discussion with government. I do see that international flow of capital for coal power is gone now. It is only the domestic resource that is available. Going ahead, such restrictions will also come in other sectors. And I think Indian private sector understands that those kind of restrictions will be more and more put in place where the money is by those countries who have the money. But I was very happy to see a lot of private companies of India being part of discussion on finance at Glasgow. But more engagement between government and private sector is required going ahead.
I think we've covered all questions, and also it's 5:30. So very quickly, I'll just wrap up the discussion. The sense that I at least got from the very informed and indulging and engaging comments made by our three panelists is that definitely economic diplomacy in India is undergoing a change. It's work in progress. The scope is changing. The participants are changing. The nature of engagement is changing. I'm not sure I'd yet conclude it's aggressive, but perhaps it is. With that, I'd like to hand the floor back to Dr. Mishra. Thank you.
Thank you, Pooja, for a wonderful moderate and informative discussion. Let me quickly introduce Peter. Peter is our senior consulting economist and vice chair research. He has had many positions. He served in Hong Kong, China as the chief economist for HSBC. Worked in Japan. He has a number of positions in investment bank in Merrill Lynch and Jarden Fleming and several other places. His research focuses on macroeconomic policy, financial sector regulation, reforms, financial development, financial inclusion, fintech, financial literacy, and financial education. And also he earned his master's and PhD in economics from Yale University. So Peter, over to you.
Thanks very much, Deepak. It was my great pleasure to participate in this webinar. We at ADBI are delighted to collaborate with ICRIER on this series of events and other outputs that will lead up to and through India's G20 presidency in 2023. So this is a very nice continuation of our longer-term relationship with ICRIER, and we look forward to taking it to a new level. The G20 engagement groups that were mentioned by Mr. Chaturvedi, and we certainly expect to continue to participate actively in the think tank or T20 process during both the Indonesian and Indian presidencies. First, I would like to thank ICRIER, Mr. Deepak Mishra and his team for organizing this excellent panel. I'd also like to thank the moderator, Ms. Pooja Mehra, and the panelists, Special Secretary Mr. V. Srinivas, Mr. Chandra Bhushan, Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, for excellent discussion, debate, and insights. I really enjoyed the discussion. I think the discussion touched on a number of very important issues, including the issue of vaccine supply for the COVID-19 pandemic, the results of COP26, most notably the implication of the agreement to go for net zero, which implied a solution to, there's a shift to solution targeting and the need to shift from grants to investment and develop a climate investment framework, the need for reform of the international financial system to adjust for risk-based capital, the need for institutional reforms and the relation to international commitments, including further opening of trade, including e-commerce, and then, of course, overall, the debate about the relative balance of effectiveness versus principles. I would also like to thank the other participants for excellent questions, and I look forward to future excellent events. Thanks very much, and back to you, Deepak.
Thank you so much, Peter. And so the event is closed. Have a good evening and a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.